After completing this lesson, you'll be able to understand Revit warnings and export Revit warnings to a HTML file. The objective domains covered are 5.6c, Assess and Review Warnings in Revit. Revit may produce warnings within your project for a variety of different reasons. For example, you may have an element that is slightly off axis, an overlapping element, or a constraint conflict. Some of these errors can simply be ignored, but some must be resolved before you can proceed. However, you should try and resolve as many errors as possible to promote model health and keep the performance of the Revit model optimal. Go ahead and open up the model 036 Assessing and Reviewing Warnings in Revit. The model opens up in the 00 ground floor plan. Let's begin by having a look at what causes some errors inside Revit. You'll see here that we have a series of 3 reference planes modelled, and I have some aligned dimensions dimensioning the reference planes. The reference planes are all pinned. So consequently, if I select this string of dimensions and I toggle the constraints to be equal, you'll see that Revit produces an error. This particular error here is saying that constraints are not satisfied, and you'll notice here that I have to cancel this or remove the constraints before I can proceed. This type of error is relatively safe because you can't ignore it. You have to deal with it before you can move forwards within the model. However, other warnings can be easily ignored. For example, if I model a wall and then I model the same wall over the top of the original one, you can see I get a warning. But note here, if I press Escape to come out of the wall command, I've now lost the warning dialog. I've now lost the ignorable warning. Some of these errors can be ignored, but others have to be resolved. Let's now review some of the warnings within this project. Select the Manage ribbon, and here you'll note we have Review Warnings. Let's select Review Warnings. So this dialog box here is now presenting all of the warnings, and you'll notice they're grouped together. So the first group we have here is beam or brace is slightly off axis and may cause inaccuracies. You'll note here that once this dialog box is open, most of the view commands will now work transparently with this dialog box. For example, I can open up and activate another view and then rotate and zoom and pan in this view whilst the dialog box is still open. So let's take a look at some of these errors in closer detail. So here I've just expanded this and I can see here that this structural framing element is off axis. Now for an element to be off of axis, it could be as little as 10 to the minus 9 degrees off of axis or up to a maximum of 0.2 degrees off of axis. Sometimes you can repair this just by dragging grips, but other times it's just easier to model the element again. Now, what you'll find is, quite often on sloping roofs, it's quite common to get elements that are off axis. So some people would choose to ignore this, or you could try and resolve it by, as I've said, modelling it again. We'll come back to this one, but let's look at the next error. So you can see here we have identical instances in the same place. Of course, this is something you probably don't want to ignore. This can cause problems with the joining of geometry and also quantities of items. Not only just the double counting of a column, say, or a beam, for example, but of course it can give you more material than is actually required in the project. So let's have a look at this warning here. Again, we can click on Show, or we can just rely on zooming around until we see the element. So you can see here, this is the problem. And if I select this next one here, I can see quite clearly that I have 2 elements over the top of each other. Notice here, of course, that I can actually go ahead and delete one of these elements. Now here I can actually see the element ID. So if I want to delete the very last one I modelled, that will be the one with the bigger element ID, which is this one here. So let's go ahead and delete checked. If we go back to review our warnings again, you can now see we've just got our beam and brace that's slightly off axis. And as I've said, I could just go ahead and remodel this again. If you're checking the model on someone else's behalf, or you're a CAD manager or BIM manager, it can be quite useful to be able to export all of these errors out and then present those to the people producing the models for resolution and repair. To do this, we can simply click Export. And you'll notice here the error report is exported as a HTML file. So let's go ahead and click Save. And the error report is now written out. Let's take a look at that report. So the report is now open, and we can clearly see our beam or brace is slightly off axis. And here it's telling us the section that's off axis and also giving us the element ID. Now here, of course, I can simply just copy that to the clipboard, and I'm now going to use this to go ahead and select that same element in my Revit model. So here we are in the Revit model. To select this element ID, select the Manage ribbon, and on the Manage ribbon, you'll note here we have Select by ID. I can now simply paste that into the dialog box and then click Show. And here's the beam that's off axis.